Welcome to the Comic Watcher Show. I'm your host, Matt Meyer. With me, as always, is Nicholas Osborne. And we're coming at you on a special day, special time, because we are honored to hang out with author extraordinaire Rob Williams. He's going to talk to us about his recently collected Judge Dredd story, End of Days. Rob, thank you so much for hanging out with us today. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good, man. Thanks very much for having me. I'm excited to talk to you about Dredd, all things Dredd.
All things Dredd. So, for those on the other side of the pond who might be a little less familiar with Judge Dredd, other than, perhaps movies and the odd pop cultural thing, sure. This story was percolating in 2000 AD for several issues. And what's it about? End of Days, kind of evocative title.
No, that means I have to pitch it after I've written it. That seems counterintuitive. No, it's right. Judge Dredd, if people aren't aware, is the lawman of the future. Basically, in a couple of 100 years' time, there's been a nuclear war, and pretty much there's all that's left is megacities, a few megacities, and the entire East Coast of America pretty much makes up Megacity 1, and they're ruled by the judges, who are effectively just cops, basically, but just heavily armored and sort of fascist as well, which is a little, there's a bit of satire there as well. This is this is a cautionary tale. It's not somewhere we'd like to go. But Dredd is the meanest and the hardest of those, and he's been sort of he is the law, and he's been doing that for decades now, keeping the citizens controlled as well as safe, because he's nice like that.
And why End of Days? I mean, Dredd has kind of done it all at this point in his 4-decade-plus career, real time. He's got the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse to contend with now. What brought you to that?
I think I did a Dredd story a few years ago, which seemed to get a good response, called The Small House. And there was a line in there about the fact, which I think is something that's true of Dredd's world, is that End of Days is the end of the world. It is what it says on the tin. And the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse have come, and the world is ending. But Dredd's world kind of ended a few years, a long time ago, really. The apocalypse occurred, and this is just what's left on is humanity clinging on by its fingernails, and pretty much by the force of will of Dredd and the judges, they've managed to keep people alive. So I just kind of thought, well, considering it'd just be fun to kind of have Dredd go up against sort of the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse themselves. He's gone up against the Dark Judges in the past. There was Judge Death, Judge Fear, Judge Mortis. People know those. They're very famous characters. But this is kind of like there is no going back from this. This is the end. So there's a character I wrote in a different Judge Dredd story called Ichabod Azrael, who's a sort of a cowboy from the Old West, and we followed his journey through the afterlife after he died. And I just came up with this idea. I thought it'd be really apocalyptic and cool if one night Ichabod Azrael rides at midnight to the walls of Megacity 1 he's got a severed angel's head in a bag, and he turns up with a message, and he says, the Four Horsemen of Apocalypse are here, and this is it. The world is ending. So from that point, it's kind of a road movie, an apocalyptic road movie through Dredd's world.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really that apocalypse that got me hooked onto this immediately, just off the premise, because death isn't exactly a new force of nature or character for Judge Dredd. We've seen, and you touch on it a little bit early on in End of Days, when they mentioned that death is coming, and Dredd's like, is this a Dark Judges thing? Because we've kind of seen this. Yeah. So I wanted to see if you could elaborate a little bit on the difference between this version of death that we see and what we've come to know of death in previous Judge Dredd stories.
Well, the Dark Judges and Judge Death is that is a very freaky alternate world, a scary alternate world, where basically at some point the judges realize the only people who are committing crimes are the living. So if you want to wipe out crime, you've got to kill everyone. So there's a logic to that. But it's the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse in End of Days is kind of, it's very much a kind of, if you want to call it biblical. This is sort of almost like this is sort of like the sort of the shut off button for the universe, for this reality, has been activated. So it's far more a kind of a primal kind of cosmic kind of threat than because one of the scary things about the actual Dark Judges, Death and Fear and Mortis and those guys, is, you know, that there is a kind of a twisted logic to it, where with this we're dealing with far more sort of primal forces, I guess.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. They talk about how it's kind of a more spirit-based force of presence or force of evil that we're kind of going up against in the apocalypse here.
Yeah, and just the fact that Ichabod turns up, he's come from the afterlife with the warning. He's carrying a severed angel's head in a bag. You do know that we're immediately into kind of these are not the normal perps that Dredd takes down. This is a sort of, we're going into cosmic areas here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wanted to see if we could talk a little bit about some of the connective tissue to some of your other work so far, like The Small House and Control. There's not a whole lot, like this is a very standalone story. You can just pick it up and enjoy it. But for people who have read a lot of your work before, there are some connective threads, especially with characters like Giant, who we see show up and play a significant role. What's it been like sort of taking and building on some of your past stories to give us End of Days?
Well, one of the cool things about Dredd, and Dredd runs in 2000 AD weekly, and there is no one Dredd writer. There's a bunch of us, basically. I mean, it's still John Wagner, who's the creator of Judge Dredd. He still writes Dredd, but considering there's 50 or so weekly Dredd stories a year, you know, we kind of dip in and dip out. So and what we tend to do are, the individual Dredd writers, we give ourselves our own little cast to play with, and so you tend to lay seeds, and you'll come back to these characters. And Giant is one who he's a African American judge. He's been a kind of one of Dredd's most trusted sort of sidekicks. He's not really a sidekick, he's another judge, but he's someone Dredd trusts, and Dredd doesn't trust many people. But you know, I used Giant in The Small House. He was and there was a bit of a falling out at the end of The Small House between Dredd and Giant. So having him along here he's one of the few people who's known Dredd for years and survived it. I mean, Judge Anderson is in End of Days as well, as part of their crew, who basically go out in this ship and travel to try and find the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. So it's really kind of it's kind of a Magnificent Seven type of deal, where Dredd's going to look around. He needs a small team. He's like, who do I trust at the end of the world? Who's going to have my back? And Giant and Judge Anderson are two of the characters he absolutely does.
Yeah, that's so true. I love that point. I never really thought of it like that, because when they're going up against Smiley in The Small House, they're going up against these covert people who are, you know, kind of invisible, and there's a small team who are operating under Smiley.
Yeah.
And we see that play on fascism that I think you do really well, because Dredd eventually kind of does that himself. He's got his own team here, and he's operating kind of under his own way, and he tells the authorities, I don't even respect your authority anymore, and he does his own thing.
Yeah.
And injecting that fascist element into Judge Dredd as a character and the overall premise is something that you've handled well, not even just on End of Days, but also in your past stories as well.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, The Small House was largely a story all about the fact, facing up to the fact that Dredd and the judges are fascist. You can't get away from that. And so it's really important to sort of, I think, sort of to acknowledge that if you are going to write Dredd with any kind of gravitas, you know, and especially in the days we're living in right now, where sort of, you know, fascism's on the rise, you know, and it felt like, you know, it's as I said at the start, I think, you know, Dredd is a cautionary tale. You know, he's like, it's. I think if people think he's some kind of, there should be more Judge Dredds on the streets, then that's a scary, terrifying thing. That is absolutely not what we want, because it would be Dredd's world is a pretty terrifying, horrible world to live in. But one of the great things about the story, and why it's survived so many decades, is in any given week, any given story, Dredd is the good guy or the bad guy. He can be both just equally. If you're a citizen in Mega City 1 and there's some terrifying danger, Dredd will absolutely put himself between you and that danger to try and save your life. He will sacrifice himself for you without a doubt. So there, he's the hero. But if you're a perfectly good altruistic person and you've got like a candy bar, illegal candy bar in your pocket, and it drops out of your pocket and he spots it, he will smash your teeth in and put you away for 10 years. And there he's the bad guy. So that complexity is something that is really one of the main fuels, I think, for why Dredd is such an interesting character to write.
How do you, as a writer, thread that needle? Because it's such a balancing act, right? Between the fascist lawman and the quasi-hero. And it could be so easy for the wrong writer to send the wrong message. I mean, to go into that a little bit if you could.
But I think it's all about the context of the story, because again, one of the great things and one of the energies of Dredd is you can tell any story in that world, and people do. You know, one week it's a ridiculous comedy strip, the next week it's high tragedy. You know, it's a badass action story. I mean, you can do all these things with Dredd. I think you know, as I say, it's just making sure you have the balance. I mean, there are certain things which are in the DNA of a strip, which are, one is black humor, one is satire. You know, I think if you play it straight and you just have him as the action hero, you know, you can do that, but you have to then probably come back the next week and pay your dues and do something which is has a bit more substance and is true to the spirit of the story. You've got to have your wits about you, but it is very easy to kind of, I mean, that's one of the reasons I wrote The Small House, was I felt I'd written a few Dredds where I felt a bit uncomfortable, but he was a bit too much the hero. So I think, well, let's show, you know, the very important sort of side that he, and as I say, with all that's been going on, you know, in our country, in your country, we've seen horrible images of sort of, you know, riots and, you know, police in riot gear, which don't look dissimilar to Dredd, you know, and more than ever now is the time, I think, if you're going to write Dredd, you need to be aware of the, you know, the balancing act. You know, it could send the wrong message very, very, very easily.
Yeah,
that's definitely,
and like I think you can have, I love the complexity and the range that he offers, because you can have a story like Chimsky's Law, where it's kind of like this vigilante monkey going all through Mega City 1, and then follow up with something like End of Days, and it doesn't feel confusing. It fits within the character.
Yeah, and there's always been, if you go back to sort of just the start of, you know, 2000 AD and, you know, the early 70s, in the late 70s, early 80s, and even the art style, Dredd one week would be drawn by Mick McMahon, which is sort of very sort of over the top, exaggerated, sort of, you know, amazing artist. And the next week he'd be drawn by Brian Bolland, who is far, far more rooted in a realistic approach, you know, and it never missed a beat, you know. And I think, as I say, that's one of the great things about it. You do get things like Chimsky, you do get ridiculous. I mean, this week I've been writing a new Sensitive Clegg story, which is a completely ridiculous comedy. So you can do that as well. And because the city is insane. I think pretty much that the world has gone mad post-apocalypse, and the citizens are mad. And so you can argue that you need that sort of authoritarian boots on the neck to stop everyone freaking out and just killing each other on a daily basis. On the other hand, that takes away a huge amount of freedom. So there's so many interesting things to play with in this strip.
Yeah, absolutely. And how do you kind of balance that with a story like End of Days, where it works under the premise of Judge Dredd inserting himself in front of danger to protect humanity, and it puts him, it does cast him in a somewhat of a hero role, and even though they do some pretty messed up things to get to their eventual end goal, how do you kind of still balance that need for fascism to make the character land as well as he really needs to, while still playing with him being a hero?
Without giving too many spoilers away at the end, something does happen to Dredd at the end of the story, which is sort of in our big finale. I wrote a Dredd story which Dylan Teague drew a few years back called Meat, which was all about one citizen doing a bit of research on Dredd and looking him up and basically realizing that he's killed more human beings than anyone ever has in history. He's the worst killer. It's all very well. You know, if you have this thing where you go, there is a MacGuffin, there is the Four Horsemen apocalypse need to be found and killed if we're going to save the world. You absolutely send Dredd, but he's not Spider-Man. Do you know what I mean? He's just there's a weight there, and I like to think in the end of days, even though it puts him perhaps more in the kind of, you know, the hero role for the majority of the story, he carries a lot of, you know, his past actions with him, and I think end of days physically you see that, because one of the great things Henry Flint did, particularly in drawing his sections of a story, was you really see that sort of the cost of going on this adventure, you know, this journey for Dredd and for Anderson. They look like hell by the end. They sort of they encounter Famine for a start, who just wastes them away, and so it's and there's a beat by the time they're heading to sort of a final showdown that I think Giant looks at Dredd and says, look, you know, he just keeps going through force of will alone, basically, where any lesser man would have dropped a long, long time ago, you know. And I think that Dredd, for all his ills, one of the things that Dredd does have is force of will and determination, unlike any human being ever.
Although there is an interesting beat that gets touched on kind of in the second act, but the idea that Dredd's getting a little older.
Yeah.
And he's still tough as all as nails and willing to do whatever it takes, but at the same time, he's human and has his limitations. Is that something specifically that you wanted to play with this story, confronting mortality, or is it just kind of a cool story beat that happened?
No, it's something I've been playing with for a while, actually, because with Dredd, I really like and respond to writing old man Dredd as I get older and grumpier and bits of me start falling off. I just think he's, you know, because one of the cool things, again, about the strip is Dredd ages in real time. There's been no reboots as you got with, you know, your Batmans and things like that. You know, Dredd is in his 60s now, you know. I mean, there is a thing that because of future technology and medicine has evolved to such an extent that he's got so many cybernetic parts that he's kind of, him being 60 is not what 60 is in our world, you know.
Sure.
But he feels it, and every day on the streets of Megacity 1 is a war. So effectively, he's been fighting a war all these years. So he's a immensely grumpy, dark, sort of battered PTSD sort of figure, basically, and he's very angry. I mean, I think, you know, that's one of the things about. I just think they're lucky that he's a lawman, because if he'd been a criminal, he'd be the most terrifying criminal you've ever known in your entire life. So yeah, this is very much old man Dredd. I did a story called The Man Comes Around with R.M. Guerra who drew Scalped a few years back, and that was again a story that was really about Dredd looking at his own mortality and the fact, feeling his age, put it that way, which I think is far more interesting to me writing Dredd at that age than it would be if he was in his 20s just starting out.
Sure.
You know what I mean?
Well, it brings a completely different energy to it. Like the Dredd as a character is akin to the Punisher in the sense that he doesn't change and grow and have narrative arcs, but Dredd remains. The world around him changes, and he is responding to it. So,
well, I'd argue that he does grow and he does have character up, but they're glacial. They're just like it's not like the rest of us. Yeah.
But that puts not a burden necessarily, but a challenge on writers to continually come up with challenges for him and new sets of circumstances.
Yeah.
How do you feel like your approach to writing Judge Dredd differs from those before you in that regard?
Oh, I mean, I can't speak for anyone else, but I mean, I always I struggled a bit early doors with writing Dredd, and I think because it's very easy to see you. There's one way of doing Dredd, which a lot of people have done very successfully, is that he's the straight man, and the city is the comedic or the tragic, and you tell the tales of the city. And that's fine, and I did that a while, but I felt like it was kind of surface level. And then I just kind of, for whatever reason, I felt like I'll try writing Dredd, because he's not RoboCop. But one of the great misconceptions with Dredd is that he's like a robotic, he's this stoic, he is stoic, and he does turn up and just say things like, I am the law, wrong move, creep, and all that. But there's a man underneath that outfit. And I kind of thought, well, let's try writing him and what's going on bubbling under the surface there. And that really sort of fascinated me. And I think he is a very, very interesting character. And the Small House was, as you said, on the one hand, he's not a thinker. He's not a great mind, basically. He's not a great intellect. He's a blunt tool. But, as you said earlier about sort of, the contradictions that are there of the fact that, in the Small House, Dredd is trying to stop Smiley because basically he's doing something illegal. He's doing illegal assassinations. But what Dredd does in putting his own team together, like as you say, and is taking Smiley down because, and as he says to Smiley at the end, he says, "This is, it's called the Small House." He said, "No, this is my house," basically, and that's, it's a cool line, but it's also, I think it's kind of at the heart of that story, which was like that. Dredd's looking for his next fight, basically. He's always looking for his next fight, I think. Whether he would know enough to consciously verbalize that is another matter. But I just think he's, I think in a way, sort of being a cop is kind of, being a judge is kind of like almost like a justification for him to go around and doing what he would be doing anyway, probably.
Yes, that's right? Such a great point. That ending of Small House, it is intense. And the line, "This is my house," comes after a pretty brutal scenario that happens with Smiley. And I really don't want to give away too much, but like the whole, small house, no, this is my house. And it really gets a sense where this maybe isn't just duty for Judge Dredd. Like this,
absolutely. Yeah. And similarly, when he turns on the Small House, he turns to the Chief Judge, Hershey, who he's known for years and has worked with for years. And he, in front of a bunch of other senior judges, basically says to her, "I no longer recognize your authority." At that point, he is just lashing out, and that's a very human thing to do. That's not duty and by the book by any stretch. He's just messing things up, basically. Because he's angry at that point. Yeah, definitely. And then angry Dredd is something that is terrifying. Yeah, it is. It's it's just like, I was thinking like with Punisher Max, you mentioned earlier, he is a bit like Frank Castle, I think, where especially when someone like Goran Parlov draws Punisher Max, you think if Frank Castle was coming for you, you would not stand a chance. You know what I mean? You would just, I think, if Dredd came for you, you could just forget about it, basically. It's over,
It's so true, really. I kind of want to take a step back and look at the release of this book, because we had some information release last year sometime about when it was going to come out, and they dropped the cover, and it was, kind of evocative of a cover at a time when the United States was under a lot of turmoil. And, 2000 AD put out a statement on it, and I'm not sure, I think it got delayed to the release of this year. Can you talk a little bit about what that was like for you during the release of End of Days?
Well, it was more so, I think, because there's a story in the collection called Carry the Nine, which is co-written by Arthur Wyatt and drawn by Boo Cook, and the general idea of that was at the end of Days, there's an accounts judge. The most exciting stories are always accountants, right? There's an accounts judge, and the judges say to her, "Look, we need to pay to repair the damage that End of Days has done to the city. Because spoilers, the city possibly may survive, and it may not be the end of Dredd." Anyway, oops. But so she, their economy is screwed, and she's she's modeling and trying to. Not modeling in swimsuits, I should point out. She's doing financial modeling. That's an entirely different thing. She is doing modeling to sort of see where she can take money from to try and repair the city. And one of the things, the judges are fighting this war on the street every day against crime, and they're never going to win it. And so she basically just late one night goes, well, what if I take money from the judges and put it into education? And she sees them, her modeling tells her that the crime levels just drop. So she goes, oh, hang on, there is a way to win this war. But it's effectively, she has to then go to her bosses and say, I want to defund the police, basically. So we wrote this story, and then what happened in the States happened, basically. We were seeing that stuff play out. And Arthur Wyatt, who co-wrote it, lives, he's up in the Northwest. I think he's up in Portland, if I remember rightly. And it was kind of going on in Arthur's city, you know what I mean? And Arthur was emailing me going, this is, you know, I feel a bit uneasy about the timing of this one. So it was a coincidence. It wasn't done to reflect what was taking place, but it was just one of those things where the timing was really strange.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And Dredd walks that line really heavily where some things hit really close to home.
Yeah.
And the timing and the socio-political circumstances of its release can kind of impact what you take away from the book. And
no, one of the great things about Dredd, like any good sci-fi, is that it's very often it predicts things that are coming, and always has. I mean, if you look back, and I mean, even this ridiculous when I started reading 2000 AD in the 80s, you know, the most ridiculous, over the top stuff like fatties and needing belly wheels to keep, you know, and how sugar is illegal in Dredd's world, you know, and that all seemed like crazy sci-fi stuff back then, and you see what's going on with, like, just in our country, sort of the obesity problem and everything. You know, there's so many things that Dredd has, you know, the Dredd strip has predicted over the years. It very often comes, you know, it's like I say, it's a bit of a cautionary tale over many things, really. Sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And hopefully End of Days isn't too predicting anything, because that's pretty tragic.
Well, I mean, End of Days was all written before COVID. And then one of the, you know, in End of Days is one of the Four Horsemen is Pestilence.
Yeah.
And they have to go and take down Pestilence. And I wrote this scientist who'd been, you know, playing with, you know, plagues up in the North Pole, and one of the plagues sort of gets out and sort of threatens to, and that was all written before COVID, and then End of Days was running in 2000 AD, just as COVID was starting to kind of, you know, we were all looking around and kind of going, oh, this looks terrifying. Yeah, exactly. So that was like, that's not the best timing, because I think if people are going through a pandemic, the last thing they want to read in their comics is comics about pandemics, to be honest. But I don't know. I mean, everyone seemed to go and watch the Soderbergh film Contagion. Like, that went mad.
Right.
Don't you have other things you'd rather be watching than what's going on in our world right now?
So let me ask, this is something more of a curiosity of mine, is 2000 AD publishes weekly.
Yeah.
As a writer, and I mean, obviously you're writing in shorter installments for each week, but what kind of a challenge does that pose to you as a writer?
Well, yeah, I mean, if I was the only Dredd writer, it'd be terrifying, and I don't know. I mean, the people like John Wagner, who has written Dredd for decades, you know, for long periods, John was pretty much the only Dredd writer. If not, you know, Alan Grant, you know, would co-write with Dredd, but John's been there for a long time. The idea of, I mean, because I kind of like, I go off and I work on other projects and I write other things, and when I've got a cool Dredd story, I pitch it and come back, and I really like it because you tell the story in 6-page chunks, and it's kind of like there's no room for messing around. You kind of have to kind of hit your beats very quickly and leave a cliffhanger and get out. So I feel like it's a very pure form of storytelling, and it really sort of, you know, again, I think John Wagner said this years ago, telling stories in 6-page chunks sort of sorts out the men from the boys, basically, because all you've got a chance to do from a narrative structure point of view is you do your setup, you do your goal basically in the middle, and then you have a killer cliffhanger, and then you're gone for the week. So I kind of feel like it's a bit like sprint writing. Do you know what I mean? It's like trying to do the 100 meters as opposed to trying to trying to do a mile, something like that.
Sure.
But then sort of the challenge then is sort of to not hang around as well and overstay your welcome. So a lot of the best Dredd stories tend to be like little 2-3 parters, things like that.
Sure, that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. And there's always kind of, they'll go through 2 or 3 parters for a little while, and then we'll fall into an epic.
Yeah.
And, this End of Days, really, I think it's that freedom of formatting that it kind of offers, where you're doing this 6-page chunks, but it's in a contained arc, and it can also expand into a much larger arc, and then it can follow through in threads and other contained stories.
Yeah,
and
sure.
It's a pretty interesting way to write. But I would like to segue that into another question that I'm sure you get all the time, which is a totally different writing process. I think it's in like 2018, Hollywood Reporter drops an article that says you've completed a pilot script for Mega City 1, a TV show, which is a very totally different thing. Did that kind of work in your formatting or your process for Judge Dredd, that you just have a cool story so you want to pitch it? Or how did that work out for you?
Oh, well, I can't. I mean, for a start, I can't say anything. I will get shot. I will be pulled. I will be taken away by the judges themselves.
It's Isaac Cube time for that one.
Big time. I mean, it's true. I mean, I've written there is a pilot script, and I've sort of laid out sort of the major beats for what would be the first season. It's a totally different process, because I mean, I write for TV as well, it's that short, sharp thing of like writing for 2000 AD, which we just talked about, of 6 pages chunks, and sort of you've got the pacing is entirely different. But I mean, all I can say about Mega City 1, and we all have fingers crossed that it happens, is that it's trying to kind of approach it, I guess, from like this, from a streaming service point of view, and trying to kind of not take anything for granted. You have to walk that fine line of introducing an audience to Dredd and Dredd's world, and the city, who you have to assume have no idea who he is, but you also want to, I guess as the MCU does so well, you want to kind of take the things that work brilliantly and then just put them into an accessible kind of package for people, but I mean, one of the things that I can say about it is a genuine attempt to do the Dredd that you would recognize from the comics if you've been reading the comics for years, and as brilliant as the Alex Garland movie was with Carl Urban, that was a very sort of straight action, sort of very heavy action thing, great job, but a large part, as we've said, of Dredd's world over a tone over the years has been the black comedy, has been the satire. So it's trying to have, you could have sort of a plot could be action, and B plot could be satire, and C plot could be Chimsky or something like that. Do you know what I mean? It's an attempt to sort of marry those things, really.
Oh, very cool. And that sort of inspiration, whether it's for comics or introducing an accessible package for a TV show, there's the satire element that has made Judge Dredd so timeless, and it's kind of just a straight read on United States culture and a lot of fascist elements, from the design to the actual stories. I want to see if we can talk a little bit about your influences on what you bring. From somebody across the pond. It's always fascinating for me. I live in Texas. I was, born and raised here. When I pitch Judge Dredd to a friend and I want him to read it, I'm saying, this is a satire on United States from writers across the pond. So it's how they're viewing United States. So what are some of the things you take into Judge Dredd that you've kind of noticed, or some observations like that?
Well, one of the interesting things about it is the fact that John Wagner, who was a co-creator, was born in the States. He was, he is America. He moved to Scotland and lived in Scotland for many years. So it does have an one of its main voices is, partly an American voice. And then Carlos Escoera, who designed him, is Spanish. And Carlos, grew up in Spain where fascism was a real thing, So in that sense, it's weirdly, I know we all get lumped into the Brits thing, but you've got like it's a very, very Scottish voice in John, and a Spanish voice, and it's not really. If you look in the history of Dredd, it's not too many. Am I wrong about this? Not too many English voices, really. I mean, I'm Welsh. People like Gordon Rennie, Scottish, and I don't know. That's a weird thing. I don't know why that is. It's not. It's never been. I would say it's never been. Oh, let's look at America and laugh. Everything that goes on there is entirely indicative of things going on in I mean, God knows what's going on in our country right now. There's always something politically in our sort of in our worldview that you can sort of you can find a Dredd story from. Yeah, it is an interesting thing. It's a British comic, and it decided to, instead of sort of putting the megacity in London, which would be a bit more parochial, really. There's something about the fact that it is the entire coastline of America is just this huge and epic and sort of I think it's interesting. Just I know it's been difficult to get 2000 AD in the States over the decades, but I think now digitally, I'd like to think that it's far more accessible, and these collections as well.
Yeah.
But and I find it really interesting the amount of people who love the Carl Urban film as well.
Yeah,
that seemed to get.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite, I guess, comic adaptation films ever. I mean, that always comes up. Everybody lists their favorite Marvel and DC films, and I'm like, have you seen Dredd?
Yeah, but there's a weird thing that it didn't do that brilliantly at the box office, and I find it's so counterintuitive. Like if it's every now and again, someone on Twitter will kind of go, "Oh, we want a Dredd sequel," and it'll get thousands of likes. People will be like, "Oh yeah, that was the best film." It's like, did you people all? Where were you? Did you go and see it in the cinema? Right. I did something similar this week about the Nice Guys, the Shane Black movie.
Oh yeah, brilliant.
I said, that was on TV over here this week, and I said, let's forget bring back the Snyderverse. Let's do let's do a Nice Guys 2. There's thousands of people were going, yeah, I love that film, absolutely. It got retweeted so much, and it's like, well, that film didn't do very well in the cinema, but I don't know.
I had a train of thought there, and I utterly lost it because I got thinking about film stuff. But so I want to talk about 2000 AD itself. It's been a few years now since Grant Morrison started taking the helm there a little and taking charge. What is that experience like working for such an idiosyncratic personality?
Well, I mean, Grant worked for. Our paths never crossed it. I think Grant was kind of like. And Mark Miller were working for 2000 AD in the 90s. So I came on and started writing for 2000 AD in about 2002, something like that, by which point I think Grant and Mark had disappeared. No, I mean, Grant did things like Zenith for 2000 AD when I was growing up, which blew my mind.
Well, I was talking about more recently, and I guess maybe I'm misquoting or something, but I thought Mr. Morrison was actually the creative mind behind or creative director behind 2000 AD these days. Am I mistaken? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, strike that record for a question from the record.
No, it's not. I mean, basically, Grant was and Mark had, there was a thing for a long time whereby, that's where you came from before you went off to the States to Marvel and DC. It was like Comics University. You went in Britain. You went to 2000 AD, and like people like Alan Moore and Garth Ennis and all those guys. I don't know if that's the same these days. It feels like there's a path now whereby. British creators just go straight to sort of an image book or something like that instead. But yeah, it's no, I've met Grant once or twice, but it was never to do with 2000 AD.
Forgive me, I completely got my facts wrong on that. Nick,
I would like to follow up a little bit on the introduction of 2000 AD into the United States and kind of that market, because it, like you said, the digital accessibility has helped a lot. We've also seen Judge Dredd license out to like IDW, and
Right.
we've seen it's an alternate universe that's not set within the real time aging 2000 AD Dredd, but it is a way for people in that market to access the character. Is that something that you'd be interested in writing and taking on an IDW Judge Dredd story, compared to something like 2000 AD?
I guess I consider it for as if I had a cool story to tell set in that kind of era, because I think, like we were talking before, in Dredd in 2000 AD right now is in his 60s, and I think that the IDW Dredd is very sort of first few years on the streets type of deal. Yeah, sure, if it's a cool story, but I think it's a good way to sort of for the direct market, people who buy it in comic shops, if they struggle to get 2000 AD to get to know the character. But yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting now that Rebellion, who published 2000 AD, seemed to be, before COVID, they were putting out a best of 2000 AD collection. So I think they're sort of trying to tap more into the direct market themselves these days. But yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. And so for somebody who is interested, maybe somebody in Texas who I'm trying to pitch Judge Dredd, what are your iconic Dredd stories that you feel like you would recommend to get somebody into the character?
The Apocalypse War and Blockmania are always my go-tos. They are sort of effectively that's a Dredd mega epic whereby there was a lot of tension for many years between the Sovs and Mega City 1, and it is what it says on the tin. Basically, the missiles start flying, and then Dredd's got to save the day. And that's just a week after week of just the most insane, the best action comic you'll ever read in your entire life. I genuinely believe that. And then you can't go wrong with sort of the Dark Judges. If you want to give one, that's probably a better idea. If you want to give one Dredd comic to someone who goes, I don't know about Dredd, it's drawn by Brian Bolland, for one thing. It doesn't look bad. Do you know what I mean? It's a decent looking comic. And you just get one of the most iconic comic lines of dialogue of all time in that one. You get gaze into the fist of Dredd, basically.
Yeah.
Which, if there is one, that's probably the one to go to.
That's so
great. All my stuff as well. I would like to point out my stuff, obviously.
Small house, control, meat, end of
I know,
days.
the small house. Yeah, definitely. Buy the small house because I've got bills to pay.
So, I mean, at this point in Dredd's publication history, it's fair to say that he's something of an institution, not unlike Doctor Who in his own way.
Yeah.
Is there a level of intimidation at all that you feel carrying that torch?
A little. I mean, I think that's the way if you write any. I've been fortunate to I've worked for Marvel and DC, and I've written a lot of big iconic characters, and you always feel that you are a little scared of the history and what's gone before, but that'll just paralyze you if you fixate too much on that. You've just got to just tell the best story you can tell and see where the chips fall, basically. So I mean, I think I grew up reading 2000 AD, reading Judge Dredd. If you told me I'd be writing Dredd as a grown up, I never would have believed you. So I think it's far more a sort of, I don't know, a blessing than it is something to be terrified by.
Right.
But the standard is fairly high from what's gone before. Yeah, there is that. So yeah,
right. Like you don't want to be sitting there paralyzed by the thought, God, I hope the fans don't consider me the guy that screwed up Judge Dredd.
Ruined Judge Dredd. Yeah, that could be on my gravestone. They said it. Yeah,
I mean, standing on the legacy of iconic creators like Wagner and Bolland, and then you come in with something as epic as End of Days. There's a lot of weight there. So what does the future look like for you and as far as Judge Dredd goes?
I really don't know. I mean, it's kind of, there is, well, for a start, we have fingers crossed about the TV show and sort of, Mega City 1. That would be good. It's just to try and carry on. I mean, the bottom line is if you've got a cool story, you think, that'd work, then I'll pitch it and I'll do it. I mean, it's not, I'm not trying to build some kind of legacy with the character. It is purely just as long as if you're having fun with it, then I like to think the readers will. But it's interesting. Like there are so many great creators who've written Dredd in years past, like Bolland and Mick McMahon, John Wagner, people like that. But I mean, in this modern era, I've been fortunate enough to work with people like on the Control graphic novel came out just before Christmas. That's an entire collection of Chris Weston's artwork, because the stories Chris and I have done. And to me, like, Chris is the modern day sort of Bolland, basically. And then with Small House and End of Days, we have Henry Flint, who's like the modern day Mick McMahon. So, I like to think, even after we're gone and in the retirement home, there'll be people still telling amazing Judge Dredd stories, because it's always the future. You know what I mean? That's the thing. We're not catching it up. There's always something to take the piss out of. Can I say take the piss out of?
Yeah.
There you go. There's always something to take the piss out of.
Well, yeah. You can say take the piss. I mean, if I can get 2000 AD wires crossed against heavy metal by mistake. No.
It was heavy metal. That's right. That's
Total brain fart. Total brain fart. But anyway, I actually think that was a great note to end it on. Rob Williams, thank you so much for hanging out with us. And Judge Dredd, the gift that keeps on giving. End of Days collection is in stores now. You can check it out. It is awesome and totally worth your time. I want to thank our sponsors, Frankie's Comics, Carson's Corner, and Lemon Juice Comics. And again, thank you to Mr. Rob Williams for hanging out with us and talking Dredd today. Until next time, we remain your faithful comic watchers. Be good to each other. Support your local comic shops and get all your news and pro reviews from comic-watch.com. Thank you so much.